Welcome everyone. I'm David Smith, Chair of the Australian Trucking Association. While the current environment has impacted the delivery of the TMC that we're used to, this year we're doing things differently to continue our tradition of providing valuable content to industry. I'm excited to welcome you to the TMC Online, an innovative online conference that will bring you the latest updates from industry, with plenty of stories, presentations and demonstrations. Over the next 2 days, we have a number of interactive live sessions which will be recorded and available all week, in addition to more than 50 on-demand sessions. Plus, there is plenty of opportunity to build your network and connect with peers through the messaging features and activity stream. I'd like to thank those who have made TMC Online possible, our dedicated sponsors. I'd also like to extend a special thanks to PACCAR and its dealer network, who have partnered with the ATA to present the Technology and Maintenance Conference for more than 25 years. I will now welcome PACCAR Managing Director, Andrew Hadjikakou. Thanks, everyone.
Hello, I'm Andrew Hadjikakou, Managing Director of PACCAR Australia. Welcome to the PACCAR and Dealer Technology and Maintenance Conference for 2020. This year has presented many challenges for us, and while it would have been great to have met each other face to face, the ATA have developed new and innovative ways for us to carry on with the conference. The conference has a new online look, and while COVID has changed many of the ways that we operate, it hasn't changed the way that you need to be confident in what you're doing and delivering high quality service to your customers. Conferences like TMC give you the learning, experience and tools to be successful in your roles. On behalf of PACCAR and our dealers, we hope you enjoy TMC Online. And now, to get things underway, I'd like to introduce you to a very special speaker. Lachie Smart was only 18 years old when he solo flew around the world. With this mission in mind, Lachie went out to prove to young people the power of hard work and persistence. He now works with businesses to help them examine and define how they should work with young people. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Lachie to TMC Online.
Well, good morning, everybody. I just want to say it's a huge pleasure to be here and sharing with you, opening for the TMC Online event for 2020. And it's sure been an absolutely incredible year and very challenging for a lot of us, especially I'm imagining in the heavy vehicle industry. So well done to everybody for the hard work and getting to where we are today. I just wanted to start off, if there's any issues with the technology, please let us know. This is a first for a lot of people. And so we're really excited to present, but at the end of this session, so in 40 minutes time, I am going to be making time for some questions and answers. So if at any stage during this presentation, you guys have any questions, make sure you write them down or remember them. And at the end, we'll have the opportunity to interact and answer some of those questions together. So I would like to kick off my story by saying I think there's probably a few differences in the aviation industry and in the heavy vehicle industry. We operate a little bit differently because it's not like a car or most of the life experiences that people are used to, where if you've got an issue, you have time to pull over and assess. In an aeroplane, if there's an issue, you've got tens of thousands of feet to drop to the ground before you have time to think. And it's the same in a heavy vehicle. If there's an issue, it takes a lot longer to stop than if you're in a car. And so at the forefront of our minds is always safety, preparation, and a big consideration for maintenance. And I'm guessing that's what the purpose of your conference is about. And so that's something that I'm going to focus on today with my presentation as well. I'm going to have some photos to share up on the screen, so make sure you keep your eyes on the screen as well as your ears focused in, because we're going to have some pictures to back up the stories that I'm going to be talking about as well. So as I was mentioned in that fantastic introduction, I had the crazy idea that when I was 18 years old, I wanted to fly solo around the world. It was something that came to me when I was actually 15. And I was sitting on the lounge next to my mum when an episode of 60 Minutes came on called Flying Ryan. Now, when I was a 15-year-old, I was a pretty timid kid. Always loved aviation, but I really didn't have any idea about what I wanted to do with it. I just knew that I wanted to fly aeroplanes. And so when this episode of 60 Minutes came on called Flying Ryan, and I saw the story about Ryan Campbell, a 19-year-old Aussie teenager who tackled the world and flown solo around the planet, I thought, wow, that's phenomenal. Maybe I can do something like that. And I wasn't always an ambitious kid, but I had a great group of friends. And they'd always said to me, Lachie, I want to start a business, or I want to have my family by 25, or I want to own my first home at 21. And I'd say, that's a fantastic idea. You should go for that. Why wouldn't you? And then they'd come up with the excuses that a lot of young people come up with, which is, I don't have enough money. I'm too inexperienced. I'll do it when I'm older. And that was the thing that always came up and stuck in my mind was, I'll do it when I'm older. And I thought, well, why? Why should we always put off these ambitions and ideas that we have to do when we're older, when we're perfectly capable of doing them now? And I thought, well, it probably comes down to, in Australia, we've got a pretty severe case of tall poppy syndrome, meaning that the people who stand out often get cut down because of a number of reasons, including jealousy. And it's typically the Australian way that we like to stick in the crowd. And I thought that's a stigma that I think we can break. And so I thought, well, what can I do that's ambitious and that's challenging and that hopefully can start to break this stigma, particularly within the younger generation of it's not okay to stand out. And so when I saw this episode of 60 Minutes come on the TV, I thought, that's it. I'm going to do my own world flight, break the record and become the youngest person on the planet to have flown solo around the world. Now, what I didn't know at that stage is how much money it was going to cost, how much planning it was going to take, and the fact that more people have gone to space than have flown solo around the world, which is a crazy statistic. And it really, when I learned that, put things in perspective about how challenging this was going to be. And so I really didn't tell anyone. It was just before my 16th birthday. I hadn't even flown a plane solo at all, let alone was I anywhere near ready to tackle this challenge. And so I didn't tell anyone, but I started planning in secret. The only person who knew was my mum at that stage, and a couple of weeks later, my dad. And so when I told Mum, as soon as I saw that episode, I turned to her on the couch and said, Mum, I'm going to be the next person to fly solo around the world. I'm going to do it at 18. She just looked at me as if I was this idiot, like I was crazy. And she said, okay, all right, in that way that only mums can do without seeming condescending, but also encouraging you at the same time. And so I started planning. I started with the route planning, like trying to figure out where I would go. And it was terrible because I obviously had no idea what I was doing. I had basically no flight training. And so I made a lot of mistakes early on. And what I very quickly figured out was this was going to be a very long flight. But with long flights comes a lot of expenses, and aviation is not cheap. To figure out how I was going to put fuel in the aeroplane, how I was going to pay for the accommodation, how I was going to pay to learn to fly, because all of these things really were going to start to add up. And when I did the maths, it was coming up just shy of $500,000, which is a lot of money. Now, I was 15 and 16 years old at this stage, and my parents, they were great parents, don't get me wrong, but I certainly didn't come from a family with a lot of money. My parents split up when I was 2, which I'm not complaining about because, hey, I got 2 birthdays, 2 Christmases, 2 lots of presents. Who's not going to love that as a kid, right? But with that came its own set of challenges, and Mum would work 50-hour weeks to put food on the table and pay the rent. And Dad, who owned a small business, would have times when there was lots of cash, and then there were other times when we were remortgaging the house to keep the company afloat. And those are all the challenges that come with being a human being. But at the same time, it certainly meant that my parents weren't going to be forking out the nearly $500,000 this trip was going to cost me. So I figured out that I needed to get some partners on board. Now, I'm just going to quickly share my screen now and put up a picture of my aeroplane, if this is going to let me do it. I'd picked out the aeroplane called a Cirrus Sr22. It's a single-engine piston aircraft that I knew was capable of doing the trip, but it looks like this is not going to let me show the screen, so we're just going to have to bear with me here. We might just keep chatting. It's a single-engine piston aircraft, And I knew it was capable of flying solo around the world because I'd seen that one other person had taken this aircraft before. But what I didn't know is how much modification it was going to need. And so I'd started planning and finding this aeroplane. And I had someone who lined up and they said, okay, Lachie, we believe in you. We'll let you use our aeroplane. And then 3 months before the trip, they pulled out. And I thought I was going to have to start the planning again, because what's very specific about this is that certain aeroplanes perform very differently under different amounts of weight. And so I had the Cirrus planned, but when that aircraft got pulled, I thought I was going to have to start again and find a new aeroplane. Luckily, 2 months before the planned takeoff date, we had another aircraft pull through, and it was a Cirrus SR22 once again. And so we managed to recover that situation. But during that last 3 months of planning was when the rubber really hit the road, so to speak, and we had to figure out how we were going to find the last bits of money we needed. Now, when I started planning this trip, I said I was pretty young. I was also very inexperienced with business. And so I didn't know anything about pulling together a team or anything about finding sponsors who were going to put their money behind a crazy 18-year-old. Because unfortunately, a couple of years before I took off on my trip, a father and a son out of the United States had tried to do their own version of the trip as well. And they'd made it 3/4 of the way around the world. They'd taken off in the United States, they'd flown across the Atlantic into Europe, down through the Middle East, through Asia Pacific. They'd even stopped in Australia. And then they'd flown halfway across the Pacific Ocean, and they'd stopped off in American Samoa, which was one of the places that I was going to land in Pago Pago. And when they'd taken off out of Pago Pago, they'd put just a little bit too much fuel in the plane. Just a little bit too much. And they'd taken off, their center of gravity shifted backwards on takeoff, and unfortunately they lost control of their aircraft 500 feet off the runway and ended up crashing into the Pacific Ocean. And on a clear day, you can still see their aircraft at the bottom of the ocean. Now that was on the news as I was beginning to plan my trip. So naturally, there's a lot of worried people that was 2 pilots who were both relatively experienced. One of them had thousands of hours of flying, and I was going into this with hundreds of hours of flying. So there was a lot of aversion to the risk that I was going to be taking. And so I thought, how am I going to get around this? So I put a big proposal together. I thought I knew what I was doing. I was ambitious, I was young, and I started contacting sponsors. Any company who I thought had some sort of link that they might be interested in sharing a part of my story, and in return for them giving me money, I would be able to give them exposure and some great brand alignment. And I did this for a full year. I contacted hundreds of companies, and that's not an exaggeration. I mean, we had in excess of 400 companies that we targeted with our sponsorship proposals. Some of them were via emails. Some of them I would call on the phone. If I could get in contact, I'd even try and organize meetings. And a lot of the time, they'd see the proposal about a world flight and think that's great. And then I would walk into the executive's office and they'd see my little 15, 16 or 17-year-old face, and they'd laugh me straight out of the room. And that's, of course, natural because, hey, it is risky adventure, and the last thing you'd want to be putting your money behind is someone who's inexperienced going into this. So I understand it's a challenge, but at the same time, we need to have big thinking if we're going to overcome big problems. And so after an entire year of planning, a full 12 months where I'd been contacting lots of sponsors, I had an idea of the aircraft I wanted to use. I knew how long it was going to take me, when I was going to do it, what message we were going to share. After an entire 12 months of planning, have a guess at how many sponsors you think I was able to pull on board. None. 0. I was not able to get one sponsor, not one partner, one company, one person who was willing to put a single dollar or service behind me and this trip. And that was the stage that I nearly gave up for the first time. Because if I thought, I've been at this for a year, I've got a year and a half left till I'm going to take off. If I can't get $1 in 12 months, how in the next 18 months am I supposed to get nearly $500,000 and be fully trained and ready for this trip? And that was the stage that my dad turned to me when I said I was thinking about quitting and said, don't you dare. You've put a lot of hard work into this for the last 12 months. At least give it 1 more month. And if nothing changes, then you can think about quitting. And so I said, okay, I'll give you 1 more month. And so I kept working for a month. Now, my idea of working at that stage was I was still in school. So I'd been working after I get back from 3 p.m. I'd finish school. I'd get home by 3:30 and I'd work through till 10 o'clock at night, sleep, get up at 6 o'clock in the morning, and then keep working until I went to school again. When I got into the school holidays, it was just full bore, straight into the trip, all day, every day, weekends included. I was going to give this my everything for one more month. And sure enough, in that month, we got our first partner on board. It was a law firm in Brisbane. They weren't going to give me any money. They were called Thomson Gear Law, but they were going to do my legals for free. And that was a big deal, especially if you know lawyers, right? And so I had this first partner behind me, Thomson Gear Law, and I thought that's a great name to have believing in me. And so the next time I went to a sponsor, I just had a little bit more confidence and I had someone who was backing me up. So instead of walking in and saying, "G'day, my name's Lachie, I'm 17 years old, next year I'm going to fly solo around the world, I'd like you to be my first partner," I could walk in and say, "G'day, my name's Lachie Smart, I'm 17 years old, next year I'm going to break the record to be the youngest pilot to fly solo around the world. I'm going to send this fantastic message to my peers, and I've got a great team behind me, including some awesome partners like Thomson Gear Law and a number of other people." Now, what they didn't know was the number of other people was like my grandma, my mum, my dad, my friends and family. That didn't matter. I had one name behind me now. And as soon as other companies started to see that they wouldn't be the first, that they already had someone who'd done their due diligence and had jumped on board with me, that's when we're able to start to snowball other partners in. Until over the next 18 months, we had enough companies and partners on board to make the $500,000 trip possible. And out of the over 400 companies that we ended up targeting, we had a total of 28 companies come on as sponsors, which is a very low acceptance rate. If you think about it, less than 10% of the people we contacted. So one of the words I'm most used to hearing is the word no. And I think that's one of the best skills that I've been given as a young person going into this trip, because when you're asking someone for help, the worst thing they can do is say no. And I've realized that after you hear no enough times, it doesn't sting as much anymore. And it's helped me get a lot further ahead when I'm now more confident to ask for the help that I need. So coming through this, the commercial side was starting to work. I was starting to get a little bit more prepared. I was going to be able to fund the trip. We were going to have a great team of people. I had some media partners on board who were giving me lots of media coverage. In the end of this trip, we ended up reaching nearly 6 million people around the planet with our media outreach and able to send that message very successfully to a lot of young people. But then the other side was I had to be prepared as a pilot. Now, I had no idea what I was doing. I was 15, hadn't gone solo when I started this trip. I went solo just after my 16th birthday, and that was to fly a Cessna 172 in one circuit. So I'd take off, turn left, turn left, turn left, and then land the aeroplane on the same runway I'd taken off on. And that was the stage that I was now trying to plan this solo around the world flight, which is the Olympic standard of aviation adventure. And so I pretty quickly figured out that I needed some pilots on my team as well, people who were experienced, who could help me get the knowledge and skills that I needed to safely take this aircraft around the planet. And so I started contacting any ferry pilot I could find, people whose job it was to deliver little aircraft from one point on the planet to another. So if I bought an aircraft in Canada, they'd pick it up, modify it, fly it back to Australia for me, put it back in its original state and hand over the keys. I thought these people are the most experienced pilots on the planet for the kind of adventure that I want to do. They're going to be the ones who can help me learn the skills that I need to learn. And so I found a couple of people. The first guy that I spoke to, his name was Ray. Now, Ray said, I said, "What's your biggest advice for me as a teenager who's going to take this aircraft around the world?" And he said, "Well, if you crash it into the ocean, tie your life raft onto the door, because I've crashed 6 times into the ocean, and 5 out of those 6 times my life raft has floated away before I've been able to get into it." And I thought, wow, that really puts it in perspective for me. He's crashed 6 times in his 20-year career, and all of those 6 were into the Pacific Ocean. I've got no experience going into this. And so I thought maybe I don't need to just focus on aviation, I need to focus on my survival skills as well. So at that stage, after speaking to Ray and a few other ferry pilots, I started training with the Air Force cadets into more focused survival skills. So I learned my survival skills in ocean environments, desert environments, rainforest, and Arctic environments as well, and put a lot of effort into finding the right equipment to help me survive wherever I was going to put that aircraft down if that did happen. And so I had full immersion suits for the Arctic Ocean. I had a 3-day survival kit on board, which was to cover all sorts of terrains, and a 4-man life raft, because my worst fear going into this trip was those oceanic crossings. Now, in a car, as we were talking about before, if you've had an incident, if the engine breaks down, you pull off to the side of the road and you're able to have a look and try and figure out what the problem was. For me, if I had an engine failure with my one single engine in that aircraft, it was 9,000 feet for me to drop before I hit the ocean. And then from there, I was going to be floating, and the aircraft wasn't going to float for very long. And so I had done underwater escape training, and I had a 4-man life raft that sat on the seat next to me. Every bit of effort that I could put into preparation, into knowledge, and into safety was never going to be wasted with this trip. And I had it down to a routine that I could do with my eyes shut. Now, the Cirrus SR22, it's a pretty spectacular aeroplane. It's fast, it's very safe, it's got a million redundancies on board for every situation you can imagine. But most importantly, it has what's called the CAPS system, the Cirrus Airframe Parachute System. If I had an engine failure, I was lucky enough with this aircraft that I could reach up to the roof, pull down on the big red handle, and that would use a rocket to launch a parachute out the back of the aeroplane, which would safely lower the entire aeroplane to the ground or into the ocean, which was a lot better than trying to land at 180 kilometers an hour into the water. And so I was feeling comfortable that if I had an engine failure, I could pull on this CAPS handle. While the aircraft was floating back down to the ocean, I would pop both the doors and take off the seatbelt holding my life raft in place. And as soon as I hit the water, I could throw the life raft out, deploy it, tie it onto the door handle, just like Ray had suggested, throw my survival bag in, grab my sat phone, handheld radio, deploy my personal locator beacon plus the one in the aircraft, and then cut the cord once I was in the life raft that was tying it to the aeroplane. I practiced this routine so many times that I could have done it in the dark if the aeroplane was upside down in the water. I was very comfortable with it, and I knew that there is absolutely never a time where you've spent too much effort and time on your safety, preparation, and technical knowledge. And so that was something that gave me a little bit of confidence. Now, aside from Ray Clambach, I was also speaking to a man named Gary. Gary had been delivering aircraft around the world for the better part of 25 years, and he had more experience than just about anyone on the planet when it came to little aircraft and long-distance flying. I was fortunate enough that Gary put me in touch with the contacts who would help modify my aeroplane. The Cirrus was only ever designed to be flown for up to 6 hours. That was supposed to be its maximum capacity. My longest flight, if there was no wind, was going to be north of 13 hours, with the potential of it dragging up to 16 hours if I did get a headwind. So I needed to have a lot of fuel on board that the aircraft wasn't designed to carry. And I was also going to need to make sure that I wasn't going to burn through too much oil on that long flight, because we sit these aircraft at 75% power the whole time. It's not sitting at a cruise setting, it is working quite hard. And so I was a little bit concerned about the long distance. And so I went and met with an engineer in Kempsey in New South Wales. And he suggested that I'll need to modify the electrical system to get bigger radios. I need to put a new fuel system in, and I need to rip my back seats out for an auxiliary fuel tank, which would add another nearly ton of fuel into the aircraft for me. Now, the maximum takeoff weight of these aircraft is another consideration, because normally I can only take off at 1,500 kilos. I was going to be at nearly 2 ton by the time I had all of my fuel on board. And once I'd burnt through that, I'd be down to about 1,100 kilos, 1,200 kilos when I was landing. So there was a lot of change with this aircraft as I was burning off fuel and as I was getting lighter throughout the flight. And so I went and had a chat to him. I went and chatted to the Civil Aviation Safety Authority, who oversee all of this. And it took us 6 months to work through engineers' paperwork and the Aviation Authority's paperwork to make sure we could have the aircraft in a safe condition and that it was going to be able to fly modified like I was planning for it to be flown. And so we worked through those, and eventually we put the new fuel system on board. We modified the electrical system with a brand new high-frequency radio, which would essentially bounce signals off the surface of the Earth and then off the atmosphere as well. And I would be able to speak to California from here in Australia. So it was a very powerful radio that was incredibly difficult to use. But then once I had the aircraft modified, I was told that it would be very hard to fly and very challenging. So I'd gone through a lot of pilot training by this stage. We're now 1 month out from takeoff date in 2016. And I'd had the plane modified. I went and grabbed Gary and said, will you please come with me on my first test flight with this machine with the fuel system? He said, absolutely. And so we did a test flight out to Norfolk Island. We loaded it up to as heavy as it could possibly be with my permit at 125% of its maximum net takeoff weight normally. And we flew out of Coffs Harbour and across the Pacific Ocean and landed at Norfolk Island, which was about a 6-hour flight there. Landed the aeroplane, spent one night, turned around and flew it back through a cold front, which was also my first experience of ice on the aeroplane, which is very confronting. But with that little bit of experience under my belt, I was now feeling pretty confident that I could tackle this trip. I had one more test flight that I needed to run before I took off on the world flight. I wanted to get comfortable in this aeroplane. I wanted to get comfortable flying at long distance. Needed to know how I would feel after I've spent 8, 9, 10 hours in that machine without getting out. And so I thought, what a better test run to do than around Australia before I flew around the world. And so I did. One of my last test flights before I was getting ready to take off on the 4th of July 2016 was I did a half Australia trip. On the first day, I took off out of Sunshine Coast Airport and I flew this aeroplane all the way out to Alice Springs. It was about 8 hours. Touchdown. Didn't see a single cloud in the sky. I thought, this long distance flying things, it's pretty easy. And then on the second day, I took off out of Alice Springs. I flew over Uluru. It was beautiful. Climbed up to my cruise altitude of 9,000 feet and flew down into Bendigo in Victoria. Again, it was about 9 hours in the aeroplane that day. And I was feeling pretty comfortable with it. And I thought, this is going to be a breeze. Didn't see a single cloud in the sky, which I thought was very strange. You know, I'd covered a lot of ground now. I'd flown from the East Coast out to the middle of Australia, now down south into Victoria. And I thought, man, I hope the weather is good all the time because that's made it really easy to fly. And then came the third day. I'd seen the weather was not looking too crash hot. I was supposed to take off out of Bendigo, fly down, touch down in Tasmania, in Launceston, and then turn around and come back up to Melbourne. But there was some storms forecast, so I put a little bit of extra fuel in the aeroplane, and I thought if worse comes to worse, I can just overfly Tasmania and come straight back. And so I did. I took off out of Bendigo, flew straight over the top of Melbourne, and I started crossing the Bass Strait. And there was some storms starting to build up, and I was looking at the weather radar on my iPad, which was just the Bureau of Meteorology going through the internet. And it wasn't connected to the plane. I didn't have any live radar on this aircraft because it wasn't a big enough airplane to warrant having a live radar system on it, because naturally a little airplane like that's not supposed to be flown long distance. And so I got to the north coast of Tasmania and I'm seeing a lot of storms in front of me, like concerning amount of storms. And so I pulled up my radar on the iPad just through the Bureau of Meteorology and I saw where I was and I thought, I think there's a little bit of a gap in that storm front there. I'll try and put the airplane through that gap. This was one of the worst mistakes I'd ever made in my life. I was inexperienced and I was trying to push my limits to figure out where my boundaries were, and I wanted to push the airplane a little bit to see how it would perform under these conditions, but I shouldn't have taken the risk. Because as I started to punch towards what I thought was that gap in the storm cells, I pretty quickly realized that my iPad data had been 15 minutes delayed. And what I thought was a gap between two storms was actually where those two storms had now combined into one much larger, much more dangerous storm. And as I punched into the cloud, the airplane started to get tossed around like a toy in a bathtub. That should have been the time where I turned around and flew straight back to Melbourne. But I didn't. I wanted to know where my limits were, and I pushed myself a little bit too hard. And then as I continued into the storm, things started to get worse. The turbulence got so bad that my phone would be sitting on the dash, and then I'd hit a bit of turbulence and I'd watch it float up in front of my face before crashing back down. And so I had to secure every loose object that was in the cockpit and try and get that back into a safe place so that it wouldn't hit me or knock me out while I was flying. Then my engine instruments started to drop out. All of the monitoring equipment, which tells me my and manifold pressure, my engine temperatures, all the cylinder and exhaust gas temperatures, which I use for engine and performance management, all of these tools started to drop out. And then the autopilot failed. And then my backup alternator failed. And it's like when all the lights start flashing of the dash of your car, everything started to go wrong. And it got to a stage where I was now hand flying the aeroplane off a little backup artificial horizon that I had in there because I couldn't see anything outside. I was fully in cloud, which meant I couldn't tell which way it was up, except for the artificial horizon, which I had inside the aircraft. And I got on the radio to air traffic control. And I was lucky that I was nice and close to land. So they had me on radar. They could see where the storms were. And I didn't declare a full emergency, but I said I'm having equipment failures. I'm going to need some vectors, which are a guidance from air traffic control. I'll give you a heading to fly and an altitude to fly at. Because worst of all now at this stage, because I got pretty close to the center of the storm, I was now starting to get ice build up on that aeroplane. Now, ice is very dangerous. On big aeroplanes, it's okay because they have de-icing systems. They can shoot hot air through little gaps in the front of the wing, or they have boots that'll knock the ice off. But for me, my aeroplane wasn't designed to fly through icing conditions. And so as that ice starts to build up on the wings, it stops you from producing lift and the aeroplane starts to go down. I was now starting to build ice on the wings of the aeroplane, so I needed to descend into warmer air and to get out of this storm. And so I got on, and air traffic control were fantastic. They gave me vectors. They flew me out of the mountain area that I was in as I crossed that north coast of Tasmania, over the top of Launceston Airport, and gave me a precision approach, which I then hand flew and landed in 65 kilometre an hour gusting winds. When I finally put that aeroplane on the ground in Launceston, I was shaken, to say the least. Quite honestly, I was terrified. And then I checked my phone and saw that I had 20 missed calls from different members of my team. Now, I'd put a tracking system into this aeroplane, a GPS tracking system, which would allow the team to see me at any stage. It would flash a dot up on their screen every minute with my new tracking location. Now, as I'd had all these electrical failures in the aeroplane and I'd noticed all my engine instruments dropping out, what I hadn't noticed was that it had shorted out and dropped off with this GPS tracker. In the GPS tracker, if it doesn't receive a signal for 5 or 10 minutes, it'll send out a tier 1 SOS alert. And if another 5 minutes later you haven't come back online, it'll send out a tier 2 SOS alert, which would send a text message to all of my team members saying the aircraft has gone down. They need to contact emergency services now. Now, because this airplane had gone through its electrical problems and had built up a big static build-up in the storm, I'd lost all of my electricals, including this tracker, and it sent out a tier 2 SOS alert to my family. So as far as my mum and dad knew, my aeroplane was currently crashed on the north coast of Tasmania. Needless to say, they weren't too thrilled. As soon as I got onto the ground, I picked up the phone, I called them straight back, and they were just in tears on the phone saying, "We thought you died. What's going on? Like, if you can't even make one trip around Australia, how are you supposed to do this trip around the world?" The whole team was just distraught, and I was so nervous. I thought I was confident and ready. The first 2 days of this around Australia trip had gone so well, and here I am now. Haven't even taken off on the trip, and we've nearly crashed once. And the team had thought my aeroplane had gone down. So first thing I did was, after getting off the phone to Mum and calming her down, was to call my team of engineers back in Melbourne and say, what just happened? Why did the aircraft short out all my electrical systems? I understand it was a big storm to fly through, but it also shouldn't have had all those issues. And so they started to do some troubleshooting, and we worked out that there'd been a big buildup of static electricity in the aircraft and that I needed a way to discharge that. On newer models of aeroplanes, they've since put static wicks, so they'll discharge the static electricity back into the air. But my aeroplane didn't have that. And so they figured out that the only way I would be able to discharge this static electricity was if I was to turn every single electrical system off in the aeroplane and then start them all again, if I ever got into that situation again. Now, thankfully, I had that lesson in Australia because I had air traffic control on the other end of the radio. I had great people there to help me, engineers on the phone, and I had an airport that I was able to land at as soon as the emergency started. 3 weeks later, when I was actually on the trip in the world flight, the same thing happened. And at that stage, I learned one of my best ever lessons that I'd learned as a pilot, which is that failures and setbacks are the foundations for success. Because if I hadn't made that stupid decision in Tasmania, I can tell you right now that I wouldn't be on the other end of this call talking to you guys right now. I'd be at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, crumpled up in my little aeroplane. Anyway, I'm going to get to that story in a second. But after I'd finished this flight, I got back to Melbourne. I had a good sleep. And then I flew my last couple of legs back home to the Sunshine Coast to get ready for my departure out to my new adventure of the world flight. My 2.5 years of planning had been a whirlwind adventure. I'd gone from an inexperienced pilot with no knowledge about what I was doing to someone who I was hoping was now capable of taking on this challenge. We'd built a great following on social media and traditional media. We'd managed to find some awesome companies to partner with to get to a stage where now, on the 4th of July 2016, I was ready to take off on my 45,000 kilometre journey around the world. I jumped in my aeroplane at 4 o'clock in the morning. I had very little sleep the night before. I was incredibly nervous. And just before I was ready to depart, I had to sign out of customs from Australia and say goodbye to my mum and dad and the supporters who had turned up to see me off that early and a cold winter morning on the sunny coast. And I had 2 things left to put in the aeroplane. I packed everything the day before, but the 2 things I had left to put in the aeroplane were my laptop bag, which had all of my printed flight documents in for the entire world flight. These like flight plans, customs paperwork, general declarations, immigration forms, very important things to have with me. And the second thing that I had to pack was probably the most important, which was my lunchbox, right? Because I'm 18 years old and male. There's 2 things on my mind at any one time, and food's one of them. You can guess what the other is. And so I needed to pack my lunchbox that morning. I put them next to the door at the airport. I had to walk past those bits of equipment to get into my aeroplane to take off on this trip. So I thought, there's no way I can forget. I went in and said goodbye to mum, goodbye to dad, signed this paperwork with customs, turned to walk out to my aeroplane. And as I got to the door, I turned around to give one last wave to my friends and family who were seeing me off. And of course, at that moment, I turned my back on that equipment and walked straight past it out to the aeroplane. I wasn't thinking. I was nervous. I was excited. Most of all, I was relieved just to have got to this moment where I was able to take off and actually tackle the world flight. And so I jumped in the airplane. I'd started up. I was nervous. The lights are flashing. It's still dark outside. I did a radio call and taxied out, lined up on the end of the runway, pushed that throttle lever forward, and the 310 horsepower engine kicked into life, dragged me down the runway up into the sky. And I was now out banking over the Pacific Ocean on my first leg to Fiji of this 45,000 kilometre journey. I just climbed up to cruising altitude, leveled off at 9,000 feet. And then my satellite phone starts going off, lighting up with messages. And I thought, my team must miss me already. They're just going to tell me to have a great trip and then say goodbye. And then the message read, "You've forgotten your lunchbox and your laptop bag." I just thought, oh no, not my lunchbox. I need the food. There's a 9-hour flight. I'm going to die before I land if I haven't eaten. And so I thought, well, these are my options. I can either turn back and try and land at Maroochydore again at the Sunshine Coast Airport. But then I thought, no, that's probably not going to work because I'd have to circle for 4 hours before the airplane was light enough to land because I had too much fuel on board. And then I thought the newspaper headlines the next morning are going to be pretty embarrassing when it reads, "Teen world record attempt aborted due to forgotten lunchbox." And so I thought, no, that's not an option. Option number 2 is to continue on. And I'm just going to make sure the team can get my equipment in another aeroplane and meet me in Fiji because I needed that laptop with all of those printed flight documents. I wasn't going to be able to reprint a lot of them because a lot of them were official docs. And I also needed the laptop with all of my planning on it. So I messaged back and I said, "Dad, I need you to get that laptop to me in Fiji. Like, non-negotiable, it has to happen." I had 2 nights that I was going to be in Fiji, so it gave him a little bit of time for it to meet me there. Absolute legend that he is. He jumps in his Navara, flies down the Bruce Highway straight to Brisbane Airport, and he starts looking for pilots, just anyone with 4 gold bars on their shoulder. He'd walk up to them and say, "G'day, my name's Will. My son Lockie's just taken off and he's flying around the world in a little aeroplane. He forgot this bag. Can you take it with him on your aeroplane?" And you can imagine the response he got. Pilots are seeing this crazy looking man come up to them with a suspicious bag and asking them to put it on their aeroplane while he's not going to be on the aeroplane. And so they're all saying, "No, absolutely not. We'll not take this bag on our aeroplane." This is not a word of a lie. He went through 32 pilots before he found one Virgin Australia 777 captain who agreed to take that laptop with him and my lunchbox. And that captain took off 5 hours after I did. So I'd been in the air flying to Fiji for 5 hours. Then he took off. He overtook me in the sky and he still beat me to Fiji. So that gives you a bit of an idea of how slow this aeroplane is compared to the big jets. But needless to say, I landed safely after my 9.5-hour flight. I met up with this captain and I got my lunchbox back and my laptop bag. The first leg of the flight was over and I was on my way to becoming a world record pilot. Over the next week, I zigzagged my way across the Pacific Ocean. I flew from Fiji to American Samoa, and then American Samoa I took off to fly to Christmas Island in the Kiribati Island group, which is about halfway between Samoa and Hawaii. Now, it was on this flight that I was pretty nervous because I'd heard about this father and son a couple of years before I'd taken off. I knew that this is where they'd had their incident. I was flying through a dangerous area called the Intertropical Convergence Zone, where we get a lot of storms build up just south of the equator. And I took off and I climbed up to cruising altitude around the mountains of Samoa and then headed across the ocean towards Christmas Island. And I got into a situation just like Tasmania. The storms started to build up. The aircraft started to get thrown around. I was avoiding the storms as much as possible, but it got to a stage where I was just completely encircled by storms. There was no way out of it. I had to punch through one of them. And so I picked the best gap that I could find, this time not relying on old iPad data, but instead looking with my eyes at where the clouds were moving and seeing that there was 2 big towering cumulonimbus clouds, but a small gap between them with some surrounding cloud. And so I headed into that. And this is when everything started to go wrong once again. As I punched into the cloud, my electronics started to get a little bit worse until they're completely failing. But this time, because I was on a long flight, I was also trying to manage an auxiliary fuel system. Now, when you take a bag of chips up in a commercial airplane, when you get to altitude, it expands, right? Everybody's experienced that before. If you've been on a jet and you've seen how the pressure differential acts on sealed containers, it expands because you've got a lower pressure outside than inside. This happened with my fuel tank. I had a bladder fuel tank which was behind my seat. And so I would turn around and I would have to burp the fuel tank, get the air out of it once I got up to altitude because the fuel pickup was at the top of the tank. And so I just entered into this storm cloud. The aircraft was still too heavy to be flying on autopilot because the autopilot couldn't fly when the aircraft was overweight. And so I had one hand on the controls, one hand behind my seat, trying to burp the air out of this fuel tank after I'd just taken the nozzle off where I would normally refuel it from. Now, unfortunately, this is when I hit the storm. So I had my one hand behind me, one hand on the control column. I hit the turbulence, and then the metal refueling cap swings around and hits me in the back of the head, and fuel starts pouring out into the cockpit of the aeroplane. So this is worse than last time because now I don't have an airport I can land at. Closest bit of land actually was more than 400 kilometers away. So it was going to take a while to get back to that to put the airplane down. I didn't have air traffic control there on the other end of the radio. I had my electronics going nuts, and now I had fuel spewing into the inside of the airplane, and I'd nearly been knocked unconscious because a 2-kilogram metal cap had hit me in the back of the head. Everything was going wrong. But because I'd made that stupid mistake a few weeks earlier, I knew how I was able to reset the electronics. So first things first is I stopped that fuel flow, put a cap back on, locked that off and tied it away so it couldn't hit me again. Recovered the airplane out of a dive because I'd had to let go of the controls to put this fuel cap back on. And as I climbed it back up to altitude, I reset every electronic system in that machine, turned off every switch, pulled every circuit breaker, put everything back in place, turned everything back on again, reset my GPSs and radios, and the aircraft started to fly normally once more. It was at that stage that I popped out the other side of the storm, and I was thanking my lucky stars that I'd made that stupid mistake just a few weeks earlier, because I can tell you with confidence that I wouldn't be here if I hadn't have made that. Setbacks are certainly the foundations to success. The rest of that flight, I had 5 hours left, was pretty cruisy. I got into the safe region around the equator, landed the airplane in Kiribati, had one night's sleep there, and then headed up to Hawaii. Now, the next flight was the one I was most nervous about, right? It was supposed to be the longest flight of the trip, which was from Hawaii to California. It was one of the only flights that I had a point of no return. So that would mean once I crossed that line, I wouldn't have enough fuel to get back to Hawaii. I was committed to going on into the United States mainland. but I also didn't have any diversion points. There was nowhere else I could land other than where I took off from or where I was planning to land at, because there's no other islands between those two pieces of land. And if I had more than an average of a 7-knot headwind, I wasn't going to be able to make it to the mainland of the States. So it was really important that I had to make a critical decision at that point of no return if I was going to continue on or if I was going to turn back to Hawaii. So I had to watch those winds super carefully. I ended up delaying for 4 days in Hawaii because I just wasn't confident that the winds were going to be in my favor. And a hurricane had passed through, and it was just leaving a mess of weather behind it. And so I delayed for 4 days. And let's be honest, Hawaii is not the best place to be stranded, so I wasn't minding too much. But on that last 4th day, the weather was looking okay. And so I planned that night I was going to take off. Because it was such a long flight, I didn't like flying in the afternoons and night times too much. So I needed to take off very early in the morning to make the most of that best weather. And so I planned my flight, submitted my flight plans, got my clearances, went to bed at 9 p.m. and then I got up at midnight. So I'd only had 3 hours sleep going into this, but unfortunately I just wasn't able to go to sleep any earlier because I changed time zones every couple of days. My body was still catching up. And so I had 3 hours sleep. I got up at midnight, headed out to the airplane. I'd refueled it. I did my pre-flight checks, jumped in and took off with the airplane at the heaviest I'd ever had it, 125% of its maximum takeoff weight, 17 hours worth of fuel on board. Climbed out slowly out into the night. I was only climbing at about 300 feet per minute because I was so heavy, so it took me a long time. But I took off at 2 a.m. and by 3 a.m. I was nearly at my cruising altitude of 9,000 feet, and I was on my way to the mainland. Now, it was about 6-7 hours into the flight that I reached my point of no return. The sun had come up, the weather was pretty good, and the tailwinds were relatively strong. So I was feeling confident that I was going to be able to pass my point of no return. And as I crossed that line, I can tell you it was one of the most relieving feelings I'd ever felt, because for the first time, I wasn't going to have to make that decision ever again. I was never going to have to make the choice of whether I turn back or go forwards. I was now free of that. And either way, the trip was going to be moving on from there, either with me successfully getting to the US mainland or it was going to end with a Pacific cruise in my life raft. But at least a decision was made. Over the next 9 hours of flying, I continued to go through my routines, making sure I didn't fall asleep, eating little bits of food every now and then. And then I touched down just before sunset. So I nearly saw sunrise and sunset in the same flight. Touched down into Hollister in California and ticked off my first technical world record, which was the youngest pilot to have crossed the Pacific Ocean at that stage as well. I was so relieved. I went straight from the airport to my hotel and slept for 14 hours straight. Didn't move once. So I was pretty wrecked after that. But I got up the next morning and it was time for my first round of maintenance on the airplane. Now, with airplanes, everything's based off hours, not based off kilometers, because obviously the amount of distance you can fly in a certain amount of time varies a lot. And so it was just an oil and filter change, which was my first 50 hourly that I had to do in the airplane. So I had the mechanics look at a few things. I also had some issues with the starter motor, which they had to address for me, but it was just a relay replacement, so that was okay. And got the airplane ready to go for my crossing of the United States. I zigzagged my way through the United States. I wasn't going to miss this opportunity to have some fun, of course. And so I flew from Hollister, which was just between Los Angeles and San Francisco. Flew down over LA, through the mountains out to Las Vegas, where I spent a couple of nights. Obviously, I was 18 years old, so there wasn't too much I was going to be able to do in Vegas. But also a byproduct of that was the fact that I couldn't actually stay at most of the hotels because they were all casinos and you had to be 21. So my grandma, who'd booked all of my accommodation for this trip, had put me into this hotel, the only one she could find that would really let me stay unaccompanied by an adult. And it was right next door to Hooters. And when I say next door to Hooters, I mean the Hooters sign was so large that it cast a shadow over my entire hotel. And so I sent a photo to my grandma of my hotel with me in it, and then just looking up at the Hooters sign and said, "Thanks, Grandma. Like, you've just booked me the best room in the house. Really appreciate that," of which my family was a bit mortified. And then I headed from Vegas down into Texas, up through Nashville and into Niagara Falls, and then up to Canada for my next oceanic crossing. The Atlantic is a little bit different than the Pacific. Pacific was pretty warm the whole time. And if I had crashed, I wasn't going to freeze to death in the waters because they're a nice balmy 20 to 30 degrees. It's a different story up north. I was in summer, but the waters up there stay pretty cold the whole time. And so I was pretty nervous about this flight because I knew at worst, if I crashed the aeroplane, it's only about a minute until you start to lose your functions of your body once you've been in that water. So I didn't have very long to be able to transfer into a life raft if things did go wrong. I was supposed to fly north over Greenland and into Iceland, but the weather was looking pretty terrible. So the day before I took off, I put a new flight plan change in and I diverted south into a little island called Santa Maria in the Azores, west of Portugal. The 10-hour flight went pretty smoothly. I avoided most of the weather. Obviously, the airplane didn't have any issues, and I landed there after my 10-hour flight feeling pretty confident. The next day, I submitted a flight plan for a straight line flight up into the UK. It was supposed to be another 10.5-hour flight, but this was my first experience with Eurocontrol, and they sent back a new flight plan saying, no, your aircraft is not capable of completing that flight. Here's a new suggested flight plan. And that was through Europe. I was supposed to go through Portugal and Spain and France and Belgium before making it into the UK. And there was no way I was going to extend my trip this much. It was way too long, and I knew the airplane was capable of doing the 10-hour flight because, I'd just flown 14 hours a few weeks earlier. And so I went back to them and said, no, I think the airplane's fine. And we ended up fighting up until 1:30 in the morning when they finally accepted my flight plan. And so once again, I was going into another long 10.5-hour flight with only a few hours sleep. So I was a bit nervous, but I jumped in the airplane, flew up into the United Kingdom and landed right in between Gatwick and London Heathrow airports, which was incredibly busy airspace and a very technical approach. But by this stage, I'd been doing enough flying that I was very comfortable with it and put that airplane down safely. Now, this was my first time getting to experience a proper break. I stayed for 9 days. I washed my flight suit, saw some family, and it was a great rest. But before I knew it, I was back on in the sky and ready to continue the second half of my journey. I thought this was the stage when things would start to get easier because now I was flying overland for a lot of it. Wasn't so many oceanic crossings. I thought things would start to settle down, but in fact, it was just when things started to get worse. I took off out of the UK and flew down into France. Pretty cruisy flight, but the air traffic controllers were really hard to understand. And then a couple of days later, I took off from France. I flew into Crete, just south of Greece. And then I was flying from Greece down into Egypt. And this is where I had a very big problem. 6 months before I was in this stage, an airplane had been shot down over the Sinai Peninsula for flying in a military airspace without a clearance. I took off out of Greece and started heading south. And when we get to a border crossing between two countries, the air traffic controllers will do what's called a handoff. So they'll tell you to contact the other controllers on a certain frequency. And so they gave me my handoff from the Greek air traffic controllers to Cairo in Egypt. And they said, contact Cairo Control. So I did. Jumped on the radio and said, Cairo Control, g'day, this is Victor Hotel, India Bravo Charlie, and IFR Cirrus maintaining 9,000 feet with you on 127.45. Silence. So I tried again. I said, Cairo Control, g'day. This is Victor Hotel, India Bravo Charlie, and IFR Cirrus with you maintaining 9,000 feet on 127.45. Dead silent. And so I went back to the Greek air traffic controllers and I said, look, I can't get onto Cairo. I need you to phone them, get my clearance and relay it to me through the radio. Any other country in the world would have done this. It was common practice. But the Greeks came back and said, negative, you're in Egyptian airspace now, goodbye. Wouldn't talk to me. And so I'm now stressing. I'm thinking I'm about to get shot down. My mentor, Gary, who taught me how to do this flying, he'd been arrested in the same place because he wasn't wearing a uniform. Now, that was all he'd done wrong. Wasn't wearing a uniform. And they said, you're not a pilot. You shouldn't be flying airplanes. And so now I was in the same airspace without a clearance, flying low level in their military restricted controlled airspace. And I thought I'm going to get shot down for sure. And so I started contacting anyone I could find. I tried the emergency radio frequencies, the satellite phone, long-range radio, short-range radio, the pilot chatter frequencies. And eventually, the only person I could get onto was an Emirates flight who was flying above me. It took me 15 minutes to get onto them, but they had an Australian co-pilot. And so they heard my registration come over the radio, and that said Victor Hotel India Bravo Charlie. And when they hear VH at the start of a registration, it means an Australian registered aeroplane. So he knew I was an Aussie. And he came over the radio and he said, "Victor Bravo Charlie, what are you doing so far away from home?" And I said, "I'm stupidly flying around the world. Please, I need your help. Can you relay a message to Cairo for me?" And he did. He got my clearance and he sent it through to them with his big, powerful radios and the A380 up above me at 40,000 feet. Got my clearance and relayed it back to me. I didn't get shot down as much as I thought I was going to be, and I made the rest of that flight safely into Egypt. Spent a couple of nights in Egypt and I crossed the Red Sea into Saudi Arabia, where I hit the worst turbulence I've ever experienced in my entire life. Didn't last for 5 or 10 minutes, though. It lasted for 5.5 hours, and I was starting to really feel very sore and very sick. I finished that 10-hour flight, landed in Oman in the dark, had a couple of nights there, crossed the Indian Ocean down into the southern tip, past India and into Sri Lanka, where I was nearly arrested because they were trying to extort money out of me. They asked for $5,000, so I gave them $5,000 in a wire transfer. They came back to me and said, "Sorry, we can't accept your receipt. You're going to have to pay us cash." And now I was at the end of the trip, so I wasn't going to be able to pay them again the second time, or I wouldn't have enough money to get safely back into Australia. And so I said, "No, I'm not paying you twice. I've paid you what I owe you, and that's it." And I get the phone call the night before I'm supposed to leave. "Hello, Captain. It's your handling service here. You'll bring us cash tomorrow at the airport, or we'll have you detained when you arrive in the morning." And so I don't know too much about Sri Lankan prison cells, but I didn't imagine that they were going to be too fantastic. So I did probably one of my other most stupid decisions that I've ever made in my life, and that is I bluffed them. I called them back on the phone and said, "Look, I've just had lunch with the Australian High Commission. I've made them aware of my situation, that you're threatening to arrest me. I've also had my media team on standby with an international media release, and my entire aviation network are standing by as well. If you arrest me in the morning, you will never get a scrap of aviation business again. You're going to feel the full weight of the Australian government, and you're going to have the international media knocking down your door asking why you're arresting an innocent 18-year-old who's just trying to do something great." And this was a bluff. None of this was true. There was no way that the government was really going to step in, maybe some basic consular services. The media might not have cared, and I certainly didn't have any aviation contacts that were that powerful that were going to stop all of this business coming to them. But they didn't know that. And so they said, "We'll talk to our managers." And they didn't get back to me that night. So the next morning I got up at 2 o'clock in the morning, threw my flight suit on, grabbed my bags, got out to the airport by 3:30. And I had the airplane refueled, pre-flight checked it, jumped in, called the tower on the phone, changed my flight plan and told them that I was leaving immediately. And I didn't tell the handlers that I was leaving. It was my version of the Great Escape. But I got that airplane airborne and straight out of Sri Lanka. And as I crossed into the Malaysian airspace, I could just breathe a sigh of relief because there was no way that they could touch me now. After that, I was just ready to be home. So I flew every day, one night stops in Malaysia and in Indonesia. And then finally, I made it back into Broome. A couple of nights in Broome, my parents met me there with a Vegemite sandwich. It was the best tasting thing I'd had in months. And zigzagged my way back through Australia, through Darwin, down into Longreach, then into Bundaberg. And then finally, I had my last flight back home. It was the 27th of August now. I'd been flying for nearly 2 months. And I did this flight a little bit differently. I just put the water on the left, put the land on the right. I knew I'd end up back at the Sunshine Coast eventually. Flew nice and low at 2,000 feet. And then from Double Island Point onwards, my flight instructor, Alistair Reid, he taught me how to fly, joined me in his aircraft. And together we flew side by side down the coast until he peeled off and landed ahead of me. And I knew nothing about the arrival. I'd just been told that I needed to have my wheels on the ground at 7:30 a.m. on the dot. I didn't know anything else about the ceremony. And so I thought, if this is my chance to get away with a Top Gun buzz the tower moment, like this is the only time I'll ever get away with it in my life. So at 7:25 a.m., I come down, buzz the tower, big banking turn, nice and low, line up on runway 18. And it's the same runway that I had taken off on 54 days earlier, that I'd had my first solo flight on only 2 years earlier. And then at 7:30 a.m. on the dot of the 27th of August, 2016, I put my wheels down on the runway to officially become the youngest pilot to have flown solo around the world. It was a crazy adventure. It changed my life. It gave me so much appreciation for what proper planning can do, but most importantly, the power of persistence and hard work. And now I had a message and a platform that I was able to go and share my experiences with other young people and encourage them to tackle their own dreams as well. Because being young isn't necessarily a setback. It isn't something that's going to hold you back, but it is an obstacle that's worth overcoming for a final outcome. And so now I've been lucky enough to share this story and others with companies around the planet, encouraging them to have their young staff tackle new challenges and also helping overcome the boundaries a little bit between generations, because sometimes that can be a challenge in the workplace too. Thank you guys for listening to my story. I've seen there's a couple of questions that have come through, so I'm just going to start answering those now. And if you've got any more, make sure you send them through on the chat or through to Katura or the team at ATA, and they'll be able to send them through to me as well. So this question was from Bob. The experiences with storms and heavy ice in aircraft without de-ice don't get any easier. Can't imagine doing what you have done at 18. Great effort. What's next? Thanks for your question, Bob. So that was certainly a challenge with the icing on the aircraft. But for me, what's next is for the last 2 years, I've actually been involved with business in a company that sells medical equipment into hospitals around Australia, and we export to 22 countries around the world as well. I've climbed through the ranks of that to get my experience in the business world, from just basic sales to now I've gone through management, and now I'm heading up the commercial operations of the company. So I oversee the export sales to our 22 countries overseas, and oversee the domestic sales team as well through our management structure. And that's given me some great experience to go and launch into my next project, which is helping like-minded young people go and launch their own companies and businesses as well through the networks and contacts that I've now built over the last 4 years since the world of flight. That, in addition to continuing doing this as well, I'm doing a lot of public speaking, particularly in schools. Next year, we're looking at hitting potentially north of 50 to 100 schools, in addition to youth conferences around the country. So continuing to spread that message that I promised I would 4 years ago, and continuing that goal as well. So thank you for your question, Bob. I'm not sure if we have too many others coming through, and I know the session's about to end. So I'll just pause for another 30 seconds. If anyone's got any last questions, now's a great time to send them through. Hope you guys enjoy the rest of your conference. Thank you so much for listening and having me a part of the TMC Online event. It's been a really great pleasure. And I'm just going to hand off now back to Katura and the team at ATA. If there's any questions that come through after this, I'm sure we'll be able to answer them with another short video that the team will make available to you guys as well. So a big thank you to having me on your event, and enjoy the rest of your conference and the rest of your week. Cheers.